the venture for being holistic and having Sam come in with mammals, and I know Chris is going to talk after me about insects, because as any conservation biologist knows, we need to be holistic. We need to have all taxa and all biodiversity to have integrity in the ecosystem. And I think it's very important that we look at the intrinsic value of everything if we're going to save or conserve any one or any group of species. So again, it's great to have that. And I really feel this a lot, being a herpetologist. We're kind of not really highly held for some reason, but I'm proud I'm one. And I always use, when people ask about herpetofauna, and they do ask about other things, I use a quote by Aldo Leopold, who I'm a disciple of, his evolutionary ecological land ethic, is that his quote is from Round River, the last word in ignorance is the man, meaning the man or woman, who asks of any plant, insect, or animal, what good is it? Because if it's in the system, it's been here for eons, it's an important part. And we should look at each part as integrate in part. And so none is any better than any other. So I'll start with that. And so I'm going to talk about the herpetofauna, and which are the best, the most important. and as Kevin knows, you know, fish are just amphibians that haven't made it. And as a lot of you know, from the famous words of Joseph Collins, birds are just reptiles gone bad. So we're going to talk about herpetofauna. Everything is equal. So, okay, what do we have in the state? Let me talk about that first. We have officially 63 herpetofauna species. We have some data where we can almost bring it up to 65, but we don't have it as robust enough. And I'll go through some of the species really quickly, not all of them, but just a splattering of them. And then I'll talk a little about their distribution in the state. And the crux of my talk is going to be on their function in the ecosystem, why their intrinsic value is so important to all the other taxa, and how all their linkages in the food web and about those go across. So, first with amphibians, we have 13 amphibians, 2 salamanders. The new name, the western tiger salamander, used to be the bar tiger salamander, Amblystoma marvonium, is officially our only tiger salamander of our 2. The eastern, we used to say we had the eastern, but going through a lot of museum specimens, looking at DNA, no. We have no specimens ever found of the eastern tiger in the state of Nebraska, officially. Our other salamander is a smallmouth, which is only found along the eastern edge of the state, pretty much the southeast. The farthest north one was found, it was in 1984 at Fontenelle Forest. And that was I found that one in 1984, and none have been found since of the smallmouth salamander. But the western tiger salamander, or western bar tiger salamander, is pretty prevalent throughout the state and is great food. Everything likes it. It's great. And it has no claws, virtually no toxins, virtually no teeth power, and it must make good food. I've never eaten myself, but everything else does. Okay, those are our 2 caudata, or 2 salamanders, and we have 11 neurons, or what you may call frogs and toads. Right there we have the leopard frog, both leopard frogs at top, the bullfrog, which I'll talk a little more about, and our little gastrophrynes, or our narrow-mouthed toad. And that's why I always say what people call frogs and toads doesn't really mean much. That's actually related to a tree frog. It's a Mycohyoidae. It's only this big. It eats nothing but ants, and it's called a toad. So that doesn't mean much. But we do have 11 frogs and toads, or neurons, in the state. And some of them you don't even know they're there until they call in the spring. And we would house you there, and some of our other small ones throughout the state. Going on up to our next class now, Chelonian, our turtles. We do have 10 turtles in the state. 3 of them are 100% aquatic. Our 2 soft shells and the snapping turtle are assumed to be aquatics. We have 1 terrestrial turtle, no tortoises, 1 terrestrial turtle, Garnet box turtle. That's in the same family as our semi-aquatic turtles, which make up the other 6 turtles in the state. We do have 10 lizards, and these aren't too much in the area of the Rainwater Basin. We do have some skinks there, but the majority of our lizards are more xeric, and they're in the sandhills. As you can see, we have a couple of skinks. We have 4 types of skinks. And then rounding out our 64 would be our snakes. And we do have officially 29 species of snakes. I just threw a few pictures up here. I want to say that about half the pictures are mine. Those are the blurry ones. The ones that are in focus are my students, or those that were given to me to use by Suzanne Collins and Dan Fogel. But Josh Mead was one of my students who took most of these and allowed me to use them. Probably the most common across the whole state, and the most common in the Rainwater Basin, will be our bull snake. It grows to be the largest in the state, up to 8.5 foot, and that's easily 2 foot bigger than the next largest snake in the state. It's very robust. It can take food up to probably a pound to 1.5 pounds when they get large. We have a 7-footer in our lab, and you can easily take a 1.5 pound food item. But they're a great constrictor. And then, if you look at this bull snake, I'd like you to notice that its rostrum, or its nose, is pointed. The bull snake is the only snake in the state of Nebraska that has a double scale, and the only one that can dig its own hole in soft soil. Every other snake in the state has to use the hole of another animal. So I always get the public calling me, I got snakes holes in my yard. Well, it's got to be a bull snake then. Probably our second most common, actually it's more common around urbanized and rural areas, is one of our garter snakes. We do have 4 species of garter snakes, this being the common, or sometimes called red-sided garter snake, Sertalis. It's a big fish and worm eater, but it's also very common. They will take a lot of anurans or frogs and toads. Another one across the whole state that's fairly common is our now called the North American racer. Used to be called the yellow belly racer, but it still has a yellow belly, just never changed the name. It's a long story. They are our second fastest snake in the state, and they're pretty harmless. People are afraid of them. They're not a constrictor, even though their Latinized name is Calubra constrictor. Linnaeus was wrong. They actually grab their food and rub it on the ground and then eat it whole, like all snakes. But they're a big grasshopper eater, and they will eat other snakes. They love frogs and toads, and they will eat rodents, and they will eat eggs, and they will eat small waterfowl. Very small waterfowl, but they do eat small waterfowl. Again, found across the state. And we don't have anything like a lot of people think we have blue racers and green racers and black racers. In Nebraska, we just have the North American racer, and its coloration changes with its temperature and mood. When they're stressed and cool, they're almost black. When they're, so to speak, not stressed and very warm, they're lime green. And so the same individual changes color. I watch this before your eyes. So they're like a mood ring. They do look much different for the first 2 years of life after they hatch from their egg. They're not anything like their adult. And we do have another common snake in the eastern part of the state, the western rat snake, or western black rat snake, that is probably our most prevalent avian feeder in the state. They're one of their best or most prominent diets is birds out of bird nests. There are only semi-arboreal snake liking to live in trees, and they're pretty much isolated to the eastern edge of the state of Nebraska along there. And their young look different when they hatch too. So that's just a splattering of our 29 snakes and 10 lizards, 9 turtles, and 13 amphibians. When we look at where they are in the state, this is a combination of all 3 classes, amphibians, turtles, and reptiles. You can see in a lot of these, there's some that are statewide, so these numbers don't add up to 63. But you can see the southeast quarter of the state, getting into the Rainwater Basin, is the most common, and actually that's the most common for amphibians and snakes. And as you get closer to the western parts of the middle of the state, you got 31. We do have some real different snakes, smaller snakes and lizards in the Big Bend area of the Platte. They're more like the red belly and some others. As we get out west, we get more lizards species, but a different amount of snake species, a lower amount, but even though there's more numbers of those in abundance. But we do get some like the bull snake and the racers that go across the whole state. And then we get to that northwest corner where we get even different species, the horned lizard, the terrestrial garter snake, and the many-lined skink, and we get much lower numbers. And in the southwest, we really get different ones like the coach whip and very xeric sagebrush type habitat snakes. So we look at the state, we can't really say that one area has more than another, except for the southeast of any one type. And it's more habitat and resources that say where they seem to be. But let's talk about their integrated purpose. So herpetofauna as a whole, amphibians, turtles, and reptiles, are a great linkage between aquatic systems and terrestrial systems, and this is even more so for the amphibians, but it's true for all of them. A lot of them live in aquatic systems and lay their eggs, like turtles, lay their eggs in the land. And then we have all the amphibians that lay their eggs only in aquatic systems. They have a larval form in the aquatic system, but yet they're obligatory carnivores in the terrestrial system. So they're nutrient sinks that actually move nutrients from one system to the next. And they're probably a little bit better at this than a lot of other phylogenetic classes or taxa because of their life cycle. And with primarily amphibians and some chelonians and a few things like garter snakes, they are our strategists where you have a large amount of biomass of the juveniles, hence a lot of food. And so you get a lot of, and they're intermediate predator. Okay, most of the neurons eat insects. All our lizards feed on insects, which are very prevalent. And then they get fed on by mammals, birds, and a lot of, and even other herps. And so as you can see here, and of course I have a herring with a frog, and we have a lizard eating insects as well as a frog. And again, they fit right in, and of course we have to have a heron eating something strange, so we got one of those. So here we have our birds eating frogs, or eating a frog, and the frog eating a bird. And then we have our bird eating a snake, and the snake eating a bird. So again, there are definitely intermediate linkages there. And we do have, of course, a few snakes that only eat insects, and a few snakes that only eat rodents, but most of them are opportunistic. We have some specialists I'll talk about down the line. I do want to bring in one of our anurans, and it's not only a game species, but it's the only invasive herpetofauna species we have. I've been doing some work, and my students have, especially Josh Mead and some others, And we were going back, and I was talking to our geographer, our cultural geographer named Worcester, and he found some data that showed French fur traders in the late 1700s brought bullfrogs from Louisiana to Brownville, Nebraska for a food source and tried to establish them. When we look at stuff written by Lewis and Clark, they talk about hearing bullfrogs, and they came up during June, right during their mating season. And you cannot not hear bullfrogs when they're mating. Drug-a-rum, 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 right? So they mention bullfrogs all the way up to Missouri. They mention no hearing of bullfrogs on either part of their trip once they hit Nebraska all the way up. And I think there's great evidence to say bullfrogs are not a native species of Nebraska, and definitely an invasive. For one, their tadpoles have to overwinter, which means permanent water. All other 10 of our frogs and toads, their tadpoles are vernal ponds. They don't use where there's fish. They use temporary ponds. What do we have in most of Nebraska except for the sandhills? We have a few oxbows around Missouri. All the rest of our ponds now are man-made. We have beaver ponds, but those are temporary. They would blow out every couple of years. So by having reservoirs in farm ponds, we're managing for this invasive species and managing against all our natives. And one of my students did a study looking at the stomach content of 500 bullfrogs, and 50%, and we found voles, crayfish, ducks, goslings in their gut, but 50% of their diet was other inurans. Eat more bullfrog legs, please. And I think in a lot of places, we're blaming a lot of other predators for eating small ducks and goslings instead of bullfrogs doing it. I've seen a lot of evidence at Schramm Park when even the Canada geese first hatch, these big bullfrogs, I mean, we're talking bullfrogs are like this, take off one. Next time there goes the mother Canada goose, she has 5, bullfrog that way, she has 4. Next coming back, she has 3. Yeah, they're a big predator. But again, it makes the fact that this inuran, this amphibian, is an intermediate because it is being eaten by a lot of others. But that's how it plays its role in the ecosystem. And Dana showed a lot about our sort of picture, I think this is the same picture, about duck eggs being eaten by bull snakes. And that's true. Bull snakes are opportunistic, and like a lot of snakes, they will eat eggs, and they will eat duck eggs. However, bull snakes also eat, and if we do stomach studies, and most stomach studies I've looked at, they're eating more rodents and small things like weasels and juvenile skunks that are big egg eaters. So, does the data show if we control bull snakes in the waterfowl management, do we help with nest, or are we going to hurt it in the long run because we're going to allow for more weasels and more skunks to eat the eggs? Okay. There's a natural balance there that the animals will figure out. When we intervene is when things happen. Should we intervene? I say no. When we intervene, things go awry. It'll figure itself out. And we do see a decrease in bull snakes and an increase in a little bit of data, it's not really robust, of bull snakes actually feeding more on eggs than rodents. And I don't have enough data on this, but I have a little bit of anecdotal data. I think one of the problems in the sandhills of this is another linkage. By having more windmills, more fence posts, things like red-tailed hawks now are a more advanced competitor on the bull snake after those rodents. Because now that hawk can sit there, and get those mice before the bull snake. So by putting these anthropogenic structures in the sandhills, we're giving an advantage to the birds of prey to going for the rodents over the bull snakes. And so the bull snakes, maybe opportunistic, have to go for the eggs. Again, I see about 24 of my former students here, and great graduate studies to figure that out. Want to come back? We can do it. Okay. Talking about amphibians, their eggs are massive, great protein. A lot of, it's mainly saccharide proteins, mucosaccharide proteins in that gel. There's a little fungicide and there's a little antibiotic. Great food for fish, for birds, for everything. And you can see massive. So when a leopard frog lays a massive eggs, we have literally 2,000 to 3,000 eggs that swell up. That's a lot of food for the rest of the ecosystem. That's a lot of nutrient sink. And then that frog gets its food not from the aquatic system where it brought that nutrient into. When it's adult, that frog is 100% carnivore, eating insects on the terrestrial system, bringing that nutrient back and forth, allowing for those linkages, a more intact wetland and terrestrial interface. And the amphibians that's leopard frog eggs, and here's some woodhouse toad eggs. And when they hatch, this is what you can see. This is, actually, I took this picture of the Rainwater Basin, and if you look closely, you'll see literally thousands of tadpoles in there. And except for one anurin larvae or tadpole, those in Nebraska, they are complete herbivores and filter feeders in the larval stage. Then on what we call Garter stage 32, in 24 hours, that digestive system changes from a herbivore to a carnivore. And they become an adult, only eating insects, 100% carnivore as adults. So you have an animal that acts as a herbivore, primary consumer, and a tertiary consumer in the same individual temporally. So you're spanning, and you're really an important part of that ecosystem. And again, even as larvae, they're food for insects that the adult eats later on. Moving from amphibians to reptiles, we have an almost completely aquatic Chelonian or turtle. One of our only reptilian our reptile-like in the state of Nebraska. Game species that is notorious for living long, easily 80 to 100 years. Very efficient feeder on fish and ducks and other things. Grow quite big, so they're an important part of that ecosystem. But then they come on land, at least once a year they come on land, or when they want to travel, to lay eggs. And these eggs are laid in June, and it's about 68 days for incubation in most summers, so they don't hatch until September. But the average adult snapping turtle lays 40 to 60 eggs, ping pong eggs. That's a lot of biomass, a lot of protein. Now, statistics show us 90% of those eggs are eaten by raccoons, but they can also be eaten by snakes and other things. Another thing, if there's a lot of snapping turtle eggs out there, will raccoons eat less duck eggs? Mm-hmm. If the snapping turtle populations are at what's supposed to be for that ecosystem, is that going to stop predation on duck eggs? I mean, raccoons really like snapping turtle eggs. Like that was their getting fresh. Talk about fresh. Right? Okay, I need one more. Come on, turtle, I need one more. Just in case you're wondering, when a snapping turtle is laying eggs, I can stick my hand, I have, right underneath. They're kind of in this catatonic state when they're doing that, and they don't move or strike or anything. They just sit there and drop their eggs into the hole. So raccoons that no harm. But again, here's some thing that what I was trying to get to is that these are duck eggs in raccoons on a trail cam wiping out mallard duck eggs. So, and we know bull snakes have been known to take very young raccoons. So where's the balance? Who's another reptilian in the system would be our water snakes, Neurodia. We have them statewide. No, we have and have not, and probably will never have a venomous water snake in the state of Nebraska. There's no water moccasins, there's no cottonmouth. I'll make sure I say that. I don't know how many pieces, I think I have over 1,000 points of data to show that we only have Neurodia, and not one point of data that shows a venomous was ever here. Just, I always got to say this, the farthest north a water moccasin cottonmouth has ever been verified is the southernmost county in Kansas, 400 miles, or 350 miles from our border. And can water snakes swim upstream? No. I think most water snakes go about 100 foot upstream and they lose all their energy and float back. So we can give our snakes to Kansas, but Kansas can't give us. Okay. These are fish eaters primarily, but they do eat a lot of anurans. And there was some speculation that they were feeding on waterfowl. So there's been several studies, and the studies showed that there was literally, I think, only one instance out of, I think it was 560 in the study, of a avian prey. It's almost entirely fish, frogs, prey. So they're feeding on a lot of fish, and they're mainly feeding on dead, dying fish, because all snakes in the world have to swallow their food whole, and you can't wrap around a fish and suffocate it because it has a thing called gills. Right, Kevin? Okay. And so they go after mainly dead, dying fish, but they will take any type of fish. Another one that kind of crosses the system is our eastern hognose. We have two hognose plains in the eastern. And the eastern's found all the way over to Chase County. So even though it's called the eastern, there's a Republican river area where there's a population, and I've caught them, many of them at Ender's Reservoir. So they're across pretty much the whole state. But they're a olivatory anuran feeder, which means they eat nothing but frogs and toads, the eastern one. And so, and they do, they're the ones that hood their heads out to make themselves look bigger, even though they're harmless. They're not a cobra. And they're the one that plays dead. And the eastern's the one with the white belly, so when you approach them, they hood up, and then if you go to catch them, they roll over and play dead, so herpetologists love them. You know, these are easy to catch, you know. Put in your bag. But if they also, when they roll over and play dead, they vomit and defecate, so raccoons won't eat them. I think it works a little bit, but if you're a herpetologist, you don't care to be defecated on. In fact, that's another thing used by water snakes, is that when you catch a water snake, they'll try to bite you, which isn't much, but the next thing everyone I've caught does is they vomit up all the dead fish in their gut on it, which if you're a predator, it makes you drop them. If you're herpetologist, you smell bad. It's just the way it goes. But again, they're bringing it back and forth because they're a inurin or frog and toad feeder, almost exclusively. And so they're bringing things back and forth. And so we do have another in the aquatic system that doesn't quite make it to the Rainwater Basin. It's more in the southeast corner of the state that would bring stuff back and forth. And it is a specialist, and that's the Brain's crayfish snake that eats nothing but crayfish. And having had these in the lab, they only eat crayfish right after the crayfish go through exodysis or shed their exoskeleton. So all we do is put a drop of ectotone with our crayfish. They drop their shells and we throw them in there. But here we have, you know, a snake that's feeding on crayfish and again bringing nutrients back and forth between the aquatic and the other. The other big thing that herpetofauna is great for is that they're bioindicators. By being bioindicators, they are the taxa that has the most number endangered or threatened across the world. We're losing more amphibians and now even more reptiles than any other taxa across the world. And so primarily that's with amphibians, and some of the reasons for that is they're amphibious life. They're on both the water and the land. Their eggs float and are semi-permeable, so they're not only, as soon as there's a little toxin in the water, they're affected by it. If there's a little toxin in the air, they're affected by it. And they don't have a hard shell, an amnion shell, and they're not attached to leaf material like a lot of fish eggs. They're floating half out of the water. So any change in ultraviolet light affects their embryos, bombards their embryos by development. So they're a great indicator of what's happening at low levels. And the fact that all amphibians have a seminal membrane for skin, which means everything goes across their skin. They have the most semi-permeable membrane of any taxa. And in fact, there's no amphibian in the world that drinks orally. Every amphibian in the world has to drink cutaneously through its skin. So any pollution in any water goes right into them. And anything that happens to their skin affects their health. And the other thing is that they breathe cutaneously. Some of them have lungs, but their lungs are not functioning 100%. Bullfrogs, leopard frogs, and our salamander, 80% of the oxygen in is through the skin. 80% of the CO2 out is through the lungs. So their semi-permeable membrane, their skin, if anything in there that's foreign, like a chemical, they're going to be the first to tell us. So we kind of consider amphibians, especially bioindicators and indicator species, because the way they can absorb and concentrate all these. And because they eat a lot of insects, biomagnification is very important. And of course they have very primitive organs, so these things, when diseases occur, they can occur first. And we're having knowing a lot of diseases occurring. And these diseases are not diseases that are just coming about or brought in. We're finding out things like chytrid are ubiquitous and across our whole state. And they don't cause a problem unless there's an environmental factor attacking the immune system. This is some new studies out that we shouldn't be worried about chytrid on amphibians. We should be worried about what is the environmental thing that's allowing the chytrid to take off. Because now we're finding data from records from the 30s and 20s, 1920s and 30s, that chytrid was here. It was ubiquitous, it was here forever. And it's just that the animals can fight it off. But now there's something in the environment. And that thing in the environment can hurt us in the future. So I just want to line up, I know my time's getting low, with that with salamanders, so my lab, a lot of my students, 4 of them right now, before are working on our western tiger salamander, which has disappeared from the southeast quarter of the state. We only have record of 3. We've been looking at, this is our 2018 data of where we found them, and we're using the same methodology. And they're pretty much disappearing, and we're doing a lot of studies, and we're looking at a lot of different things. Some of it we just published, and some is in the process of being published. But I think I'll end it there. I know my time is good, so I'll leave the time for questions. I just want to ask you if you have questions. And I want to thank for helping me throughout everything, not only the students that are here, but all the students that have come through my lab in the last 20 years. So